Chapter 29. Sunday, September 15th, 1776. The demons of fear and disorder seemed to take full possession of all and everything upon that day. Journal of Private Joseph Plum Martin, 15-year-old patriot soldier. I was the only person on the street. The army was gone and the city abandoned. I shivered, though the day was still warm. Had I made a mistake? Should I run after the rebels and join them? Should I go back to the Locktons? A cannon boomed to the north. No, I chose the right course. At least, I hoped I had. I headed for the waterfront. Several of the grand mansions of Lower Broadway stood with their doors ajar. A fire burned at the edge of the street, heaped with books and scads of paper. The smoke rose up into the air, drifting towards the masts of the few ships at anchor. Cannons boomed again. What if they didn't arrive right away? How long did I have before Madame grew suspicious? A gust of wind blew and carried with it the first hint of fall. Canoe-shaped chestnut leaves turned yellow round the edges. The leaves caught and piled up against the soldier's tent left behind at the battery campground. I walked over and pulled back the flap of a tent. Inside lay 2 bedrolls, a pipe and tobacco pouch, and a shirt dropped in the middle of mending, the needle still threaded and stuck in the fabric. I closed the flap. They left near everything: tents, blankets, extra clothing, cooking pots, and food. It would be a cold night for Curzon and his companions. Voices came from the waterfront, military voices shouting orders. I hurried away from the barracks, dashed down the water street, and hid behind a rain barrel at the corner of the joiner's workshop. A half a dozen flat-bottomed boats were being rowed to the docks. 2 were already tied up, and tall soldiers wearing the red uniform of King George were striding down the streets. Lobsterbacks, folks called them. They fanned out across the waterfront, their muskets primed and held at the ready position. As I watched, a 3rd boat floated to the wharf. The soldiers on it jumped out and marched in formation to the battery in search of rebel soldiers. A woman carrying a baby fled, screaming loudly. A few of the redcoats chuckled and stabbed at the air with their bayonets. My throat went dry. As the 4th boat landed, an officer stepped off and barked a command at the laughing men. They lined up and stood at attention. The officer gave another command, and the men marched off, splitting into 3 groups to investigate the battery and waterfront buildings. The officer stood alone at the foot of the dock, surveying the deserted town as more boats splashed towards the landing spot. This was my chance. I forced myself out of my hiding place and walked towards him, my back ramrod straight. "Begging your pardon, sir?" I said boldly. "What is it, girl?" he asked. Before I could answer, a soldier dashed up to him. "Captain! Campbell, sir! The campground appears deserted. The rebels left behind their tents and bedrolls." "Secure the tent flaps, open and check every one," the captain commanded. "It could be a trap." "Yes, sir," came the crisp reply from the man before the man ran off. I prayed I would not faint from fear and tried again for the captain's attention. "I can cook, sir," I said. "I can wash, sew, even doctor the sick a little. Don't bother me, child." I trailed after him as he walked towards the campground. "Please, sir," I insisted. "I'm all kinds of useful. I can chop wood and carry water or messages." I was interrupted by another soldier who approached us and saluted. "Report," Captain Campbell said. "The spies were correct, sir. The rebels have retreated. The battery is empty of men, but filled with the provisions and weapons they left behind, including several cannons. They even left a tea kettle bubbling over the fire. Civilians in the first 3 streets north of here all attest to their haste. Putnam's unit was the last one out. They're on their way to the island by way of Greenwich Road. Do we pursue, sir?" The captain fought the smile that played at the corner of his lips. "Our task is to occupy the city. We'll let the Highlanders hunt them down. Take the men to take over the barracks and prepare Washington's headquarters for Major General Robertson." "Yes, sir." The soldier saluted again, but did not move. "What is it now, Jennings?" asked the captain. "Begging pardon, sir, but I've not been informed as to the whereabouts of Washington's headquarters. If I was to be given that information, I could pursue my obligations with greater speed." "I don't know where it is," Captain Campbell said with irritation. "Use your noggin, man. Ask the tavern keeper." "You want the Kennedy mansion, sir," I said, "just beyond the end of the battery, facing the bowling green." "What did you say?" The captain fired at me. My knees were shaking under my skirt. "The Kennedy mansion, sir. That was General Washington's main headquarters, number 1 Broadway. His wife stayed up at the Mortar House, but he kept headquarters straight that-a-way." I pointed west. "And more army officers were in City Hall." I pointed north, up Broad Street. "Very good," he he said. There you have it, Sergeant. Proceed. The sergeant yelled to his unit as he walked away from us. The waterfront was awash in red now as boatloads of soldiers disembarked. Shouted orders filled the air, along with nervous laughter and the sound of British boots on the cobblestones. A few more boats were on their way in, with the first boat headed back for more. The occupation was well and truly begun. You are correct, young miss, Captain Campbell said to me. You are useful, but we do not want troublemakers in the camp. What is the meaning of the mark on your face? I touched the raised scar and decided that honesty was my only course. This stands for insolence, sir. When my mistress sold my little sister, I tried to run away. She is 5 years old, sir. My sister, not my mistress. He blinked and cleared his throat. Regrettable. And understandable. I have a younger sister myself. Your mistress, may I assume she supports the rebel cause? No, sir, I answered. Our house is Tory. My master was driven out of town by the Patriot leaders. My mistress is much cheered by your arrival. She wants to hire a proper staff so she can entertain again. She'll not miss my services one bit. The words tumbled out before I measured them. The captain's mouth hardened, and I knew I had stepped wrong. He tugged on his sash. I cannot accept your services, child. We only employ slaves run away from the rebel owners. I did not hear him right. Pardon me? Gentlemen docking, sir, said a soldier on the wharf. Captain Campbell turned as the men tossed thick ropes from the docks to the occupants of the next boat. It contained only 4 soldiers, each manning an oar. The rest of the passengers were dressed men in expensive civilian clothes. When they're ashore, escort them into the tavern for a celebration, the captain said loudly. Issue the tavern keeper an office of forage certificate. Warn him, sergeant, he is not to ask the gentleman for payment unless he wants to spend this night in irons. They are our guests. Yes, sir, came the enthusiastic response. As we had been talking, ordinary city folk had begun to creep out of their houses. Now there was a full crowd gathered, the Tories of New York who had been awaiting this day for months, years. Cheers were heard in the distance. The arriving soldiers were greeted by townsmen who shook their hands and patted them heartily on the back. I recognized a few faces, the Reverend and his wife and a few people who had called at the Locktons home. Captain Campbell bent towards me. He spoke quickly and quietly. I do not hold with slavery, but I cannot help you. We do not interfere with loyalist property. Return to your mistress. A loud huzzah from the hundreds of throats came from the battery as the American flag was pulled down. A drummer started beating time, and the Union Jack rose to the top of the flagpole, accompanied by whistles and shouts from the lobsterbacks and loyalist New Yorkers, who took off their hats in respect. A woman in the crowd snatched the American flag out of the hands of British soldiers and stomped it under her boots. The men laughed. The rat-tat-tat-tatting of the drumsticks rattled me through, setting my teeth to shaking and waking the bees who had lately gone to sleep in my brain pan. He couldn't take me. He would not. I was chained between 2 nations. The bees swarmed again behind my eyes, making the scene grow dim and distant. The sun was nearing the horizon, casting long shadows across the wharf. I was ghost-tired to the ground, not a living soul. All ashore, sir, called the soldiers, tying up the last boat. All ashore, corporal, the captain announced. I want patrols assembled immediately to keep watch in the streets and sentry fires built on every corner. Yes, sir. The gentlemen who arrived in that boat walked towards us, talking with great excitement. One of them was painfully familiar. He called out to me before I could flee. Sal, called Master Elihu Lockton, thinner from his exile, eyes bloodshot and wary. Is that you? I dropped into a curtsy and dared not say a word. He studied on me with suspicion. What are you doing here? Sergeant Jennings approached. The tavern is open, if the gentleman would care to drink to victory. Lockton waved to his companions. I shall join you shortly. As the gentleman hurried to the tavern, his eyes traveled from my head down to my shoes and back. What news, Sal? He said. How do you come to be here? I pulled Madame's list from my pocket and prayed he would not look inside my basket. Come to the market, sir, I whispered. Ah, what is this? He took my chin in his fingers, turning it so that the last rays of sunset fell on my scar. Is the eye for illustrious, or perhaps impertinent? My face burned both in the scar and where his lavender-smelling fingers pinched my skin. The breeze flew through me and told me to grab Campbell's sword and run it through Lockton's belly. And then what? And then what? I suspect it stands for insolence, Captain Campbell said calmly. 'Tis a common brand among the people of Boston. Lockton laughed at the small joke and released me. Now we'll call her Insolent Sal, a very saucy gal. The captain smiled and put his hand on his hilt of his sword. I should have known she was attached to your household, sir. She greeted me in the name of the king and thanked me for rescuing the city from the rebels. They both looked at me. We prayed for liberation, I said. Even our slaves have become political, Lockton said. How quaint. Do you wish to accompany your servant home to greet your mistress? The captain asked. Lockton shook his head. Not at the moment. Go on home, Sal. Tell Anne I shall be along after I've lifted a few glasses in celebration. The two men headed to the tavern as the sun finally dropped out of sight. I must have gone to Mason's and bought the items on Madame's list, though I remember it not. My body moved through the streets, past sentry fires and redcoats carrying torches down suspicious alleys and into abandoned houses. Around me was the sound of the victors celebrating and the smell of meat they roasted for their supper. All around me, all was darkness. Chapter 30. Monday, September 16th to Saturday, September 21st, 1776. Oh, the houses in New York, if you could but see the insides of them, occupied by the dirtiest people in the continent. If the owners ever get possession again, I am sure they will be years in cleaning them. A letter from New York in the Morning Chronicle and London Advertising newspaper. The British Army paraded up Broadway the next day, cheered by loyalists all wearing a red ribbon or flower in their hats in support of the king. I did not see this, of course. I overheard the report from Madame gave the master as they ate supper that eve with their house guests, the two officers who had moved into the bedchamber on the top floor. The highest-ranking men of the British Army had taken over the empty rebel mansions. Lower-grade officers had moved in with loyalist families who had suitable furniture and staff, such as the Locktons. Only we didn't have a staff. Becky had vanished. Her rooms at the Oliver Street boarding house abandoned. I was the only servant in the house. It mattered not. My bones were hollow sticks, my brain pan empty. I cooked a chicken and roasted potatoes and carrots. I left the chicken over the fire too long because Madame ordered the silver polished and the table linens ironed in honor of her guests. The bird was so dry it near splintered the tongues of the officers. Madame let loose on me in the kitchen after the gentleman had taken Master Lockton to Ashley's Tavern for a night of beer drinking and pipe smoking. It mattered not. When Madame finished scolding me, I set to my evening chores, cleaning out the ashes from the bedchamber fireplaces and carrying them outside, bringing in the firewood and laying the fires in case the night turned cold, turning down the beds, cleaning up from supper, and sweeping the floor. When I finally laid down to sleep, I set Ruth's doll beside my head. I had stopped kissing it good night. I did not say prayers. My bones were hollow, and my brain pan empty. Madame ran me like a donkey all the next day, then demanded that I stay awake all night to make rolls for breakfast because the bakers in town were rebels and they had fled. I did as she ordered and ruined 2 perfectly fine batches of dough. I threw them down the privy and baked cornbread deep in the night, for that was the one thing my hands knew how to bake. The cornbread burned to charcoal when I fell asleep, head on the table. It mattered not. 3 mornings after the invasion, a message was delivered to the master as I served the coffee. I set the note on a small silver tray and carried it into the drawing room. The officers were in the middle of excusing themselves from the table, buttoning up their coats and putting on their hats. After the master said his good days to them, he opened the note. A social invitation? Madame asked, or business? Neither, Lockton said. It's a desperate plea. He handed the note across to his wife. Aunt Seymour is in need of our Sal. All of her Dutch girls fled, and she is without servants. Madame snatched the paper from her hand. Surely she can do for herself. We have company. Why should we go without a servant? We only have 2 men lodging here. Somehow Aunt has managed to take on a dozen Hessian brutes. She requires our assistance. Madame gave a little shudder. Hessians. The hired soldiers from Germany had a fearsome reputation. She crumpled the paper. I will not perform housework like a common wench. Tell her to hire someone. The times demand sacrifices, Anne, just for a week or so. Women will soon come to the city looking for work, and you and our aunt will be able to hire a full staff. Madame scowled into her cup. You favor her over me, Elihu. It's unseemly. Lockton wiped his mouth with his serviette. The loan of the girl is the least we owe her. I hope you regret your decision to send away the sister. Even small hands would have been helpful now. His mention of Ruth so startled me I near dropped the tray. Madame bit back the hot words in her mouth, picked up her serviette, and cleaned off her chin. You will clean the kitchen and prepare the dinner, girl. Then you will take yourself to the house of Lady Seymour and do what she requires of you. Lockton shook his head. No, Sal, you will leave immediately. I took a clean apron and Ruth's doll with me to Lady Seymour's house. In truth, I did not walk there quickly. In truth, I dawdled something fierce. Folk said that Hessian soldiers were fire-breathing monsters who walked about with swords drawn and blood on their chins. I figured that would be as bad as Madame. I was near correct. They did not breathe fire, though. They spat when they talked. Nor did they walk about waving their swords, though some sported knives in their boots. None had blood on their chins, except when they ate rare-cooked meat. I found it hard not to stare at the enormous mustachios that sprouted under their noses, especially when the men combed and waxed them and twirled the ends. Their speech sounded like they were swallowing rocks, but Lady Seymour understood them. She learned the German from her husband, she said, same way she learned the Dutch. There were all manners of secrets locked in that old skull. When I served them supper my first night, a couple of them said "Danke" to me. Lady Seymour explained that "Danke" is German talk for thank you. She told me not to be afeard, that they were just soldiers far away from home. A couple of them were fond of her cat, she pointed out. How could men who liked cats be bad? She tolerated them fair enough, except for the muddy boots on the furniture, and when they spread butter on their bread with their thumbs. That made her gasp and go pink in the face. I practiced saying "Danke" when alone. The work at the Seymour house was every bit as tiring as it had been at Madame's, more so because there were more mouths to feed, and boots to clean, and basins to fill, and linens to wash, and coats to beat free of dust. Lady Seymour made sure I ate a proper meal 3 times a day and let me sleep in the tiny attic bedchamber on the bed where I laid after my time in the stocks. It was hot up there, but there was no mice, no worms on the floor when it rained. The city swelled by the hour with loyalist refugees who wanted to live under the protection of British cannons. Some of the folk returning from exile were surprised to find strangers had taken over their houses and were sleeping in their beds and wearing the clothes they had left behind. There were many fistfights, a great deal of name-calling, and threats of duels. The British did not mix in with the arguments. They had war on the brain, drilling their soldiers from sunup to sundown. At the Middle Dutch Church, they pulled out the pulpit, the pews, and the floorboards and let the horses of the light dragoons practice. Horses in a house of the Lord made some folks grumble, including Lady Seymour. Up to the tea-water pump, I found only unfamiliar faces, slaves who had freed themselves by joining the British. I could not bring myself to speak to them. The old man we called grandfather had vanished. Maybe he had started his own revolution and led Curzon and the other slaves over the River Jordan to freedom. A fanciful notion. 'Twas useless to ponder such things. Friday stretched long and longer because the Hessians had moved in 5 more of their countrymen. I heard Lady Seymour arguing with the fellow in charge, but he would not listen to her pleas. I spent the afternoon chopping a field's worth of cabbage, while a half-pig roasted in the pit dug by men in the flower garden. The soldiers ate their supper and drank more beer than I thought a body could hold. They lost the few manners they possessed and used the table linens for blowing their noses. It was a relief when they finally left for merrymaking elsewhere. I prepared a tray of supper and served it to Lady Seymour in her bedchamber, the one room where she could find peace. When my chores were done, I climbed to my attic room, kicked off my shoes, and laid down on the bed without even removing my skirt or bodice. Ruth's doll lay next to my head, her eyes staring up at the ceiling. I knew I ought to pray for Ruth, or for Mama, or for anything. I ought just pray, but the words would not come. I feared the spirit had left me. I slept. When I woke, the city of New York was consumed with burning hellfire.